With that, I would hand it over to you, Liz and Kadeem.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks to Kelly for doing all the hard work and coordinating this webinar and for organizing the CLE credits. That's a great thing to offer everyone. So as Kelly said, my name is Elizabeth Marx. I'm a supervising attorney at the Pennsylvania Utility Law Project, and I'm joined by Kadeem Morris, who's our Martin Luther King Fellow and staff attorney at the Pennsylvania Utility Law Project. So we're going to try and take you through all the basic things that you really should know about the LIHEAP program, which is the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program. I think it's critically important. I'm so glad to see such good registration from all of the legal aid network attorneys and from folks in the community-based organizations. LIHEAP is really something that can help an awful lot of people get some money to offset their high energy costs. So I hope you'll start to talk with all of your clients about whether or not they might be eligible for LIHEAP and encourage them to apply while the program's open. And we'll get into those details in just a moment. For those who aren't familiar with the Utility Law Project, we are a specialty project that's housed within the Pennsylvania Legal Aid Network and particularly regional housing legal services. Our focus is on low-income residential utility and energy affordability. So we get involved both on behalf of individuals and large group clients in proceedings before the Pennsylvania Utility Commission, the Department of Human Services, the Department of Community and Economic Development, the legislature, other administrative bodies, all with the singular purpose of trying to promote affordable utility and energy services for Pennsylvanians, particularly low-income Pennsylvanians. But you all should know that in addition to our advocacy efforts, we also offer training and technical assistance and support to community organizations and to legal aid providers. So if you have a case that you want some help with, give us a call, either me or Kadeem or our director, Patrick Cicero. John Sweet is another attorney in our office, and Kristen Giesemann is a paralegal. And we also are lucky enough to have a Sycamore House Fellow who's with us for the year. So call any one of us if you have questions, and our information is at the end. We're always happy to chat about how to help clients with their utility issues. So real quick agenda for us for today. I'm going to turn it over to Kadeem in just a moment to discuss and take us through 2018-2019 benefits, eligibility, how to apply, those kinds of things. I'll jump in for a little bit then and talk about some special issues, as well as cover the terms of the fall turn-on program that the department is running this fall. And then we'll close. Kadeem will take us through some of the appeals issues. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kadeem.
So good afternoon. As Liz mentioned, my name is Kadeem Morris. I'm a staff attorney at PULP, and I'm here to take you through the basics of LIHEAP. So what is LIHEAP? It's a federally funded heat and assistance program for low-income consumers all across the country. In Pennsylvania, it's mainly geared to helping low-income consumers in paying the cost of heating during the cold winter months, i.e. the program opens in November and runs right through April. So that December, right around through March, the typical cold months, LIHEAP is available then. You can apply online or in person. You can apply in person at any county assistance office, all 65 of them, or 62, because Pennsylvania has a lot of counties. And you can also apply online through Compass. So if you have prior connections with DHS, you receive public benefits and you're familiar with their system, or if you've applied for healthcare, you can also use that same system and apply for your LIHEAP benefits. So we're going to turn over to 2018-2019. So as I mentioned, the program opens officially on November 1st, which is Thursday. It's my executive director's favorite day of the year because their benefits available to poor people, and it runs through April 12th. What you can get are three things. There's a cash grant, which is just cash that's available to you to help you with your home heating needs. The minimum you can get is $200. The max is $1,000. You can get a crisis grant, which is if you are having a heating-related crisis in your home. Minimum of $25, max of $600. That's up by $100 from last year. If you remember, it was $500 last year. So now we've got an additional. That is as a result of advocacy on behalf of some of you and PULP also. There's also the crisis component of LIHEAP, which is the repair replacement of your home heating system or furnace. If it's broken down and it's inoperable, there's usually a 2-year limit for how long your system can be inoperable for. But that's a great, not as used as it should be, but it's a great component of the program for you to be aware of. So we're going to start and just go through the application process. As I mentioned, there are paper applications that are available through your county assistance office, or you can apply online. If you have previously received LIHEAP, I know postcards have already been going out to 2017, 2018 recipients, letting them know that they should apply for the benefit. The application is also available online, I believe, and some utilities may have links to the applications on their website. So that's just something to look out for. In terms of the cash grant, that's the most used component of LIHEAP because everyone's entitled to a cash grant. The eligibility requirements are the same as a crisis grant. You have income 150% of the federal poverty limit or below. Now, for those of you in the legal aid network, that should be most of your clientele, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 PFA cases, but most of the people who you encounter are going to be eligible. So we encourage you to encourage them to apply. Now, how income is defined on LIHEAP is good to know. It's gross income for everyone in the household, except excluded individuals. And what counts is income from employment, profit from self-employment, income from roomers. So if you're renting out a home and you've got 6 rooms and you rent out 5 to make ends meet, that's considered income. Unearned income, which includes public benefits, Social Security benefits, unemployment compensation, veterans benefits, and pensions. Now, what's not counted is any educational assistance you may receive, food stamps, earned income tax credits, wages for dependent children under the ages of 18. So if you receive Social Security for a child as a result of their parents, or if you receive disability for your children, that is not considered income. And also Medicare premiums that are deducted from your Social Security benefits are also not considered income. There's a full list that's available in the LIHEAP state plan if you need further clarification or have any questions. So the second component or eligibility requirement for a cash grant is that you have a home heating responsibility. So that means that you are somehow responsible for the heating source in your home. You can be responsible for the primary heating source by either paying that directly or through your rent. If you pay it directly, you can get 100% of whatever you're eligible for, 200 to 1,000. If you pay it through your rent, you get 50% of whatever you would otherwise be eligible for. And you can also apply it to your secondary heating source. Now, your secondary heating source is a heating source that's used to power or is your first primary heating source is dependent on. So you can think of it like a stove that has an electric pilot where electricity is needed for the gas to work. That would make electricity your secondary heating source in that instance. Or you can also get LIHEAP if you're responsible for your supplemental heating source. Now, your supplemental heating source is a little trickier because what it is that your primary heating source has to be inoperable, and your supplemental fuel type or heating source, in this case, it could be electricity, is taking the place of that primary heating source. So if you think of, you've got a house that has a oil furnace, the furnace is inoperable, so you're heating with electric space heaters. That therefore makes electric space heaters your supplemental heating source because that's what's supplementing your home heating needs at that point. So that's a little tricky. It opens up the LIHEAP process to a lot more people who had previously not thought they'd be eligible, but we just wanted to make sure that was as clear as possible to everyone. And the other requirement is that you be a resident of Pennsylvania. Now, there's no time frame on residency. It's just that you're here with the intent to stay in the wonderful Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. College students who are here and either live full-time on a college campus in housing or throughout the school year, they may also be eligible. That's why you can see in the income requirements, educational assistance is not counted as income because it's also catered towards college students. If you are living in an RV or camper or refurbished camper that has now become a home, you're also eligible for LIHEAP so long as you can demonstrate that the camper cannot be moved, so i.e. it's up on blocks, been like that, it's inoperable, and you have no other permanent residence.
And on the, we do have questions come up about residency, and just last year I handled a case where someone was turned away from even applying for LIHEAP because they were told they had to live in Pennsylvania for 6 months. Not the case. They can get LIHEAP as long as they intend to stay in Pennsylvania. That's what's required.
And just as a quick flashback before we go to what's not needed, your income has to be below 150% of the federal poverty limit. You have to have a home heating responsibility in either of those 3 ways, and you have to be a Pennsylvania resident. Now, what you don't need is to have a pending notice of termination, an outstanding debt to your utility, or even a direct relationship with your utility. So that means that if your service is on and you're current with your bills, you can still apply for a cash grant on the basis that, per se, your income is insufficient to meet your needs and you're eligible for LIHEAP. And you don't have to owe a bill. You don't have to be $200, $300 behind. And anyone in your household can apply for LIHEAP once the household meets the other criteria as having a home heating responsibility and the income requirements and the residency requirements. So that's really good. It's not just my mom has to apply because the bill is in her name. It's open to anyone in the household.
And I think, you know, one of the most important things is that to remember is that you don't have to pay your utility company or the fuel delivery service directly. You can be an undesignated part of your rent and just say in the lease, you know, landlord pays for heat. That would be an indirect cost to the client and included in rent. But I will note, and I just want to go back to this because it's an important distinction, the one exception to that, and let me go back to this real quick, if you pay for heat through rent and your rent is based on income, you're not going to have a what LIHEAP would consider a home heating responsibility. So just be careful about that because a lot of our clients do live in public housing and their rent is based on their income. And if that's the case, they're not going to qualify for a cash grant. Though they may, if they are responsible directly for their electricity, qualify for a crisis grant if their secondary form is required to run their heating system. As Kadeem said, if you need electricity to run your oil furnace, that would be a secondary heating source. And if they are responsible, they may still be able to get LIHEAP grant.
So as Liz mentioned, we're going to go to the LIHEAP crisis grant. Now, the income eligibility for crisis is the same as it is for a cash grant, 150% of the federal poverty limit, defined in the very same way. The exclusions are the same. And the residency requirement carries over. And of course, you have to be responsible for your heating source, whether it's primary, secondary, or supplemental. And what's unique about crisis is that there's the additional criteria that you have to have an actual or imminent heating emergency. That is, your service is off, you have a termination notice that you got at the start of LIHEAP, and it's before the start of the winter moratorium, so it'll be acted upon before the protections kick in. That self-certification is also usable. And for those who have deliverable fuel sources, the requirement is that they certify to the agency that I have less than 15 days fuel left in my tank. So if it's oil, coal, whatever your additional heating source is, that's the self-certification requirement. And of course, the unique caveat is that the crisis grant has to be able to resolve your crisis. Now, this is an important point or opportunity for advocacy for those working on behalf of clients, because sometimes the $600 by itself is not sufficient to resolve the crisis. But that's an opportunity for you to work with the county assistance office and the LIHEAP coordinators and say, my client has maybe $200 that she can pay in addition to the $600, which will take us to $800. The utility has to agree to accept that amount, whether it's less than their full balance or it's just the 800 to prevent or to end that crisis on your behalf. And the utilities often set thresholds. I know that PECO in Philadelphia has previously set a threshold of $3,000. They'll accept a crisis grant of any amount to basically end that crisis through the winter moratorium. So that's also something that you should reach out to the utility and say, I'm working with LIHEAP, getting my client a crisis grant. How much will you accept? Can we do a payment arrangement on top of a crisis grant? There are several ways to make that work for your client, so don't miss that important opportunity to advocate on their behalf. In terms of a crisis application, when you submit it to DHS, it has to be acted on within 48 hours. Now, that does not mean that you're going to get the full result that you want in 48 hours, but they have to at least pick it up, start processing it, put it into the system. And crisis grants have the unique ability to be used to pay reconnection fees and reasonable delivery fees. So if you're having an emergency delivery brought out and they charge you a fee, once it's reasonable, they can pay for that. What they cannot do, however, is pay security deposits or late fees. And why that's also important is that because people who qualify for a crisis grant are also exempt from paying security deposits for regulated public utilities. So if there's a security deposit on their account and that's an issue, that's an opportunity to say, this person qualifies for LIHEAP, there should be no security deposit on their account, get that wiped off and should have them reconnected. So Liz is going to pick up on our special issues unless there are any questions.
Okay, I don't see any coming through, but folks, if you do have questions, just feel free to jump in. We're going to cover a couple special issues that you should be aware of as far as how LIHEAP functions, kind of outside of just the program. And the first thing is, it's important to understand, and many of you are probably aware that from December 1st to March 31st, and this says 2018, but I think that was an oversight. That is every year, December 1st to March 31st, the regulations, and this we're talking about regulated utilities, so large electric companies, PECO, PPL, for the four first energy companies, and Duquesne Light on the electric side. On the gas side, you have UGI, PGW, NFG, Columbia, and Peoples, and I don't think I missed any, but I'm sure someone will correct me if I did, but any of those large regulated utilities are prohibited from terminating during the winter months, starting December 1st and through March 31st. So this creates a bit of a problem, right? Because in order to get a crisis grant, as Kadeem just said, you need to have an imminent home heating emergency, which means you have to be threatened with termination. But if households, who are income eligible for LIHEAP, if we're in the winter months, they can't by law be terminated. So LIHEAP doesn't consider that an imminent home heating emergency. So the way this often works is, once you reach December 1st, folks should have, if, they're not going to face termination of the regulated utilities anymore. So November 1st to December 1st, get them in to apply for their cash grant if they can, because later they'll be able to get a crisis grant if they are facing termination again at the end of winter. At the end of winter, once you get towards the end, regulated utilities begin issuing termination notices somewhere around February. This is because termination notices are good for 60 days. And so starting in February, the utility may actually be able to terminate the customer. Before that, they're not legally allowed to terminate, so they can't issue a termination notice. So it's important to just understand that your clients are going to start getting a termination notice probably in February. They can bring that termination notice in, apply for a crisis grant, resolve that ahead of the end of the winter moratorium. Now, I will say it's great news that the program is open until April 12th, not only because it is my birthday, but also because it provides a little bit of overlap from the end of the winter moratorium on March 31st and the end of LIHEAP. So those 2 weeks are often a very busy period where a lot of folks are getting termination notices, and they should be turning right around and going into the county assistance office to apply for crisis before the end of LIHEAP. If they don't get their application in by April 12th, it will not be processed. And we'll touch on some of that timing issue later on with regard to appeals. I do note that someone just asked whether or not this webinar is being recorded, and it is. So we'll send it out after the fact. I think it gets posted on Plan's website. Okay, so that's the WINA moratorium. Important to know how that functions. Now, I just want to touch for a moment about LIHEAP and immigration. Folks who are lawfully admitted non-citizens are eligible to receive LIHEAP. Doesn't matter when they arrived, as long as they're lawfully admitted, they can apply for LIHEAP. We have some of the eligible non-citizen status included on there. There's also a list in the state plan, and we will shortly, probably in about a week, you'll receive the LIHEAP manual that PULP puts out every year for advocates, and that also covers some of the information about immigration status. I will note that people much smarter than me have done a lot of training and a lot of thought on, there's a lot of talk right now about the public charge and what that means for immigrant status. And so I would refer you, if you're working with someone who you're not sure, or maybe there's a mixed household that has some lawfully admitted and some non-lawfully admitted immigrants, to maybe check with someone at the Community Justice Project on what the status of that public charge issue is. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'll just mention, but there is some talk about creating a rule that would ban immigrants who have received public benefits from obtaining citizenship. Certainly something to keep in mind. Not something that I have expertise on. So again, if you run into that issue and you're working with both documented and undocumented immigrants, I would recommend that you reach out to our friends at Community Justice Project.
If I can take this little break here, I'm going to launch the first of the CLE polls here. For any attorneys on the call requesting CLE credit for your participation in this hour-long webinar, you will need to respond to both polls. This is the first one that I've just launched. Please enter your response. It'll be up for 2 minutes, and thank you.
All right, well, everybody chimes in because, of course, everyone wants their CLEs. Don't forget to answer that poll. I will talk briefly about the LIHEAP Heat Meet program, which you may have heard. It's a pretty catchy term. But essentially, and without going too far into the weeds here, if your client is enrolled in SNAP and is responsible for heating costs, but have not been approved for a LIHEAP grant, they will still automatically get a very small LIHEAP grant, between $21 and $24. It depends on household size and income, but that will show up on their EBT card. This confuses a lot of folks who, are understandably worried that maybe they'll get in trouble, maybe they'll be charged for like theft if they use this money because they don't know where it's coming from. The purpose of that very small grant is that it enables the SNAP household to get the standard utility allowance for their SNAP calculation of income. It's a way to leverage additional SNAP dollars for households and has been really successful at helping people heat and eat. So we think it's a great program. It's being run this year, and do make sure to let your clients know if they're concerned. They see, that don't receive cash assistance, and all of a sudden $21 shows up on their EBT card. They're likely to be confused, but now you know and can share with them what that's for. Okay, so Kadeem mentioned already that there is a furnace repair or replacement program. This is something that I'm always surprised every time I do a training on LIHEAP, even for utility folks who work for the utilities, they don't know that this is a third component to LIHEAP. And not everybody, but oftentimes people don't know. But the LIHEAP crisis interface is essentially a program that will repair or replace a broken or inoperable furnace. It's open for the same period of time that LIHEAP is open, just like the crisis grant, they do need to begin to take remedial action within 48 hours, or if it's life-threatening, within 18 hours. So if we're in the middle of the polar vortex of 2014, acting really quickly to get somebody heat in their home may fall within that life-threatening emergency. Otherwise, 48 hours. This doesn't necessarily mean they're going to come out and fix your furnace in just 48 hours. They might come out and provide blankets or space heaters in the interim until they can get it fixed. But essentially what happens is you apply just like you would with DHS. DHS will then refer to one of the local weatherization offices, which are administered by the Department of Community and Economic Development. That weatherization provider then goes out, they perform what's needed as far as repairs or replacements or additional weatherization measures if appropriate. So it's a really great way to help folks whose heating systems are not operable, or maybe they're just not functioning the way they should. I will note that in the off season, there might also be, and even during the season, many utilities, natural gas and electric companies have their own furnace repair and replacement programs that may help if they don't quite fit the eligibility guidelines for this, or if it's during the time when LIHEAP is closed. Always check with your utility provider to see if they can do that. They often will. For natural gas, they can do emergency line leak repairs. They can repair and replace furnaces. Not all of the utilities have it, but some of them do. And it's a really critical assistance to households. So eligibility, much like the rest of the grants, slightly higher income, 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. I think Kadeem mentioned this before, but the heating system has to have been operable within the last 2 heating seasons. So if somebody buys a house that has no furnace in it, they're not going to really be able to access this program to get a new furnace put in, but it will help you if your furnace has broken. Maybe it broke last year, you didn't find out about the program till this year, but if you let 2 years go by, I do believe they can make exceptions, but the general rule is it must have been operable in the last 2 years. And then there's landlord permission, right? If you've got a renter. Now, a renter can absolutely access heating repair or replacement. So, encourage them to apply, but the landlord will need to agree that they aren't going to evict the tenant or increase the rent for a reasonable time, basically 18 months or more. Any questions on the LIHEAP crisis interface? Remember, you can submit them through the chat box. So we're going to turn now to the LIHEAP Turn-On program. And this is, I'll say, is part of last year's LIHEAP program, but it's being operated this fall. So it is a bit of a source of confusion for folks. So hopefully we can shed some light on it, though I'll admit that I am still a bit fuzzy on some of the details and how they work. But let's see if we can get through this. If anyone has questions, type them in, because this is a bit confusing. The first, so as I said, it's part of last year's LIHEAP program. So in order to get these supplemental grants that I'm about to talk about, you must have gotten a grant in 2017 and 2018. Essentially, LIHEAP didn't spend all of its funds, and instead of having to send back the unspent funds, it's operating this fall turn-on. And it is a new program. We think it's great that it's available. We're hoping that in future years, it'll some of these details will flesh out a bit. But it doesn't impact the ability to get any of the grant or assistance that Kadeem and I have talked about so far in this program year. So 2018, 2019, these grants, if they're eligible for them, are in addition to what they can get in 2018 and 2019 for assistance. So the first component of the Fall Turn-On program is the Fall Fill Supplemental Grant. This was $100 sent to everybody who received a deliverable fuel grant in 2017-2018. So notice should have been received by consumers, but we're not sure if everybody got the notice. So, you know, if you're working with someone who's got oil or coal or wood or some other deliverable fuel, like propane, make sure that they call their vendor to see whether or not they have a grant waiting for them. That may help assist them to get their first tank delivered this winter. The second component we'll call Phase 1 supplemental grants. So in order to be eligible to get this supplemental grant, and these are very narrow eligibility guidelines. One, your utility has to be participating. This includes both the regulated utilities, those large electric and natural gas companies, and the municipal or rural cooperatives. They all participated in this. I'm not sure that all of them did, but they were all eligible to participate in this portion of the supplemental program. Essentially, if your service was off or you were pending termination between July 27th and April 28th, that's the window we're talking about. Or August, what did I say? Not April, a different A name. July 27th and August 28th. If in that basically 1 month period, the customer was off or pending termination and owed $500 or less to the utility, and the utility would accept, or the utility would accept $500 or less to stop the termination or reconnect service, and they received the 2017-2018 LIHEAP grant. So if all of those are the case, the utility may have included this customer on a list that they submitted to the Department of Human Services. If they were included on that list, it would have been submitted to DHS on September 19th, and payments would have gone out on those supplemental crisis grants just last week on October 24th. So households do not have the option to apply for this. It happened for them behind the scenes. They would have received a postcard saying that they may have been eligible for a supplemental crisis grant. So you may have seen clients saying they got this postcard and they don't know what it means. Maybe you didn't know what it meant either. But that's what it meant. And so that'll be posted to their account. Folks who received a grant in this Phase 1 will not be eligible for the Phase 2 supplemental grant that I'm about to cover.
And I think, Liz, it's important to note, because I've encountered this with clients, people have received these postcards and think that they've already received LIHEAP for the 2018-2019 season. So if someone comes into you with this postcard, it's important to encourage them to still apply for this year, because that's prior year's funds and not an ongoing program.
Yes, thanks, Kadeem. That is an excellent point. Now, Phase 2, this begins November 1st, so tomorrow, our favorite day of the year. Eligibility for this is going to be, one, again, that you received the LIHEAP grant last year. You have to also be otherwise eligible for the crisis grant, and you have to have not received a Phase 1 supplemental grant. If all of those are true and you're a customer of a natural gas or electric utility, including both municipal and rural co-ops, you can apply for a supplemental crisis grant. And it's my understanding, Kadeem, correct me if I'm wrong, that DHS is going to be, if you apply for a crisis grant, they're going to process you first for this supplemental grant, and then you may still have some new crisis money available through the 2018-2019.
You should still have your crisis available if this grant is sufficient to remedy your crisis, or they'll use it all if necessary. But they use the rollover from last year first, and then you'll preserve, hopefully, your crisis for the end of the winter moratorium.
Right. But if you owe something like $1,100, and you get the $500 phase 2 supplemental grant plus the $600 crisis grant for this year, that would resolve a very large amount. It also is the case that in talking at least with PGW recently, that they are looking at raising the amount that they'll accept, or the amount of debt that they'll allow a crisis grant to go through for. So usually their threshold is somewhere around $2,000. They were thinking when we last talked to them, although they didn't have a specific number, that they would accept people for a crisis grant up to somewhere above, perhaps up to $3,000 in debt in order, because of this additional supplemental grant. There is a question, are these supplemental grants, are they related to the summer supplemental grants? They are both part of the supplemental program, but they are not. So there is this additional one, and we left it out because we thought it was confusing enough, and that we go forward. But you're very astute, Susan. Yes, they are the summer supplemental grants that went out in August. They would have been about, were they $75? And I think they went out in mid-August, and they would have been applied to folks' utility bills. That is in addition to these fall supplemental programs. So that was the first attempt at supplemental grants, and then they still had a bunch of money left over, so they've created these other phases. Now, it's my understanding that if you participated in phase 1, which would be the fall fill program, or that first list in phase 1, that you cannot get phase 2. But if you receive the summer supplemental grant in August, that should not affect your ability to participate in phase 1 or phase 2 of the supplemental grants. I hope everybody's with us. That is some nitty-gritty details there. I'm sure there will be some follow-up questions, but let's just recap real quick. The fall fill delivery for deliverable fuels, they got $100 at basically last month. Phase 1, if you had a termination notice July to August, or end of July, July 27th through August 28th, you got on this list. You didn't have to apply, but you got on the list and got a supplemental grant. If you didn't get phase 1 or the fall fill, you can get phase 2, which is basically an additional crisis grant. It doesn't impact your 2018-2019 grants. And as long as you are in crisis, meaning you have a pending termination or are terminated, you're going to be able to get that grant. So I'm going to turn it over to Kadeem to talk about appeals.
So now that we know everything that your clients could possibly get from LIHEAP, the real question is, what's the timeline within which they should receive responses? Unfortunately, sometimes there are lots of delays at the local county assistance office and the processing agencies. So it's good to know these dates so that if you're working with someone on their behalf, you can either mark your calendar 30 days out to see if they've gotten the application has been processed, or know what the turnaround time is if they're required to submit additional information. So for a cash grant, the county assistance office must send you a written determination of a decision within 30 days of receiving your application. So if you send it in on arguably November 1st. By December 1st, you should have a decision on what or how much your household is eligible for. If you don't receive that decision, I believe there's up to 60 days that you have to apply to reach out and challenge this decision. If you submit an incomplete application to the county assistance office, you should receive a system-generated notice within 10 days of that application being received and noted as incomplete, which tells you what's missing. So it might be the household members aren't completely listed based on DHS records, or your income's incomplete, or you didn't submit the correct pay stubs, but you should receive that within 10 days. And it's 10 days it's issued within 10 days after they receive your application. You then have 15 days from the date of that notice, not 15 days from the date it's received in your mailbox, but 15 days from whatever date is at the top of that notice that is sent to you to either provide the missing information or face rejection of your application. Now, if you've applied for a crisis grant, DHS and the County Assistance Office, they're required to expedite a crisis grant because, as we said, they must respond within 48 hours generally, or 18 hours if it's an actual life-threatening situation, i.e. the polar vortex that we hope never comes around again. But that's just to give you an idea of what should happen. So you should receive some sort of rapid notification of, hey, we have your application. Someone is coming out to your house to do some sort of remedial work or provide you with blankets or space heaters. In the case that you submit a crisis grant and you hear nothing, the first point of defense would be to call the County Assistance Office and try and reach out to the LIHEAP coordinator and figure out if they're missing something, or if they just don't have your application if you've mailed it in, so that you can remedy that right away instead of going through and waiting 10 days. Well, it shouldn't be 10 days, but waiting the traditional 10 days as you would with a cash grant. So the big takeaway is now whether or not to make an appeal based on a determination that you've received or to reapply. The golden rule is that once LIHEAP is open, so arguably from November 1st, right around, I would say this is fine up until maybe mid-February. If your client has applied and they haven't received a notice that something's missing within 10 days or determination hasn't been made in that 30-day time window, they should reapply right away, submit the necessary paperwork. You should also reach out to the LIHEAP coordinators we mentioned and see, is there a problem with the application? Has something gotten lost in translation? And clean up whatever those issues are. Because the appeals process is very protracted. It can take up to 60 days. And the appeals process at the close of LIHEAP is great, but it's more beneficial during the season for you to reapply, submit the data that's necessary, have that conversation with the County Assistance Office so that they can get this benefit within that 30-day time window versus the 60 days that it takes for them to appeal. Because once you receive a notice or a determination, you then have 30 days after receiving that notice to send that in. So if we're at the end of, let's say the end of February, you have until the end of March, or 60 days if they haven't processed your application. So that takes you out right until the end of the winter heating season, and your utilities can technically start terminating you on August 1st. So you don't want it to be a case where you can get that resource, but you've already been terminated, and you then have to do the additional work of jumping through 6 additional hoops to, let's say, work with the utility at this point when it could have been simply rectified by reaching out to the County Assistance Office.
And so I would say, Kadeem, I think the reapply works right up until, and you should know your client. If your client's not going to get in and reapply until after the deadline, and LIHEAP closes, and they haven't appealed, then they're in trouble. But up until the end of the LIHEAP season, just submitting the reapplication and having it processed, if you understand what the issue was that they rejected it and can fix it, then fix it, have them reapply and go forward, work with the County Assistance Office and resolve that, because a new right to appeal will attach when you reapply. So if it's then rejected a second time and you're now outside the window of application, then you can still appeal, Those appeals will take a long time, but you can still appeal it at that point.
And I would say if you have a client that's particularly tech savvy, you can have them reapply online. That way, if there's something missing from the application, you get that notice that's generated within 10 days. And then you also have those appeal rights. So you don't necessarily need to go into your county assistant's office, which may be an hour or 3-hour bus ride from where you are. It's something that you can do online. The site is also mobile friendly, so they can do it on their smartphones if so equipped. So that's just a good way to also preserve your appeals rights if necessary. So are there any questions? I know my screen's a little slower than
There
Lisa's.
is one question that asks, can a household, and this goes back to the supplemental grant. So I'm going to, bear with me, I'm going to jump us back in time on the PowerPoint. The question was, if you get a fall fill supplemental grant for your deliverable fuel, can you also receive a supplemental grant in phase 2? And unfortunately, that is no, at least as far as I understand the fall turn-on program. And again, the details are not as clear as they could be. But unfortunately, phase 2 applies to natural gas and electric utilities. But if you receive the fall fill, that's considered part of that phase 1 supplemental. So while they can get a crisis grant for 2018, 2019, and they're going to be able to get up to $600 to fill their tank if they're down to 15 days or less, they can certainly do that. But I would recommend actually, and this is an important distinction that I think we should make, and that is the timing of when you apply for cash versus when you apply for crisis. So if you're working with the deliverable fuel folks, they would have gotten the $100 fill. Come November 1st, I would have them apply for the LIHEAP cash grant. Unless they really, don't have any oil left and they need it right away, then maybe apply for the crisis. But the reason I say apply for the cash first is because if they go in and they apply for the crisis on November 1st, they're like, I need a tank, I'm going to apply for the crisis. What happens is DHS first applies whatever cash grant they'd be eligible for, and then applies the crisis. So if you have them apply for the cash grant first, they get a fill through that, so maybe they get another $200 if they get the minimum grant, or up to $1,000. They get a cash grant early in the season. Then if they run out of oil and they reach, February and they're done, they can go back in and apply for that crisis grant, which this year is up to $600. So it's not going to work in all cases, but you should be aware that the cash grant gets applied first. And so the timing of that becomes an issue. But back to the initial question, which I took us on a bit of a tangent. If you receive the fall fill, you can't get the phase 2 supplemental grant for deliverable fuels.
And Liz, if I could interrupt again here, I'm going to launch the second poll for attorneys to receive CLE credit for your participation in this webinar. So please go ahead and respond to the poll that should be on your screen now. Thank you.
All right, everyone make sure you chime in or you won't get your CLE, and we all know how important those are. We only have a couple minutes left, and we have the luxury, which we rarely have, which is that we got through most of our materials, but we'll touch on a couple of resources.
So in terms of the resource page, DHS does have a LIHEAP page where you can get information, just basic information on program eligibility, where to apply, probably also has a link to your local county assistance office. Those links are provided as hyperlinks in the PowerPoint. So once you receive it, you'll be able to just click and it should pop up. DHS also has a LIHEAP handbook, which is a more detailed policy manual, basically explaining their rules and regulations and how certain determinations are made. And as Liz mentioned, and it's forthcoming, it's being worked on as we speak, Pulp is also working on its LIHEAP Advocates Manual that we put out every year to basically walk you through all the common issues in LIHEAP, explain program eligibility and any specialized issues that you might have. The one thing I do want to mention, I've said LIHEAP coordinator a couple of times. We're not allowed to publish the list of LIHEAP coordinators, but if you are having an issue in a particular county and you can't get a resolution from the county assistance office, then you should give us a call and we should be able to either connect you with that coordinator or provide some sort of guide as to where to go. And I see that there's a question as to what efforts have been made to advertise LIHEAP. This is being recorded. So DHS is the agency that's in charge of that. They do send out postcards to people who have previously received LIHEAP. Unfortunately, the onus is upon most people within the legal aid community who encounter these people probably more frequently to let people know that this form of assistance is available. I haven't seen any television ads recently, but there are other ads on television, so maybe after there'll be space for LIHEAP ads, but there isn't really a ongoing campaign that I'm aware of outside of the postcards.
The other thing that does happen, and utilities, I mean, LIHEAP is a large generator of revenue for them, and they do a lot of efforts within the community to promote LIHEAP, to get people to enroll. And in fact, it is a requirement of most of the customer assistance programs that the utilities run that folks also apply for LIHEAP. So that's, you know, something that the utilities have been very helpful in supplementing the state's efforts to promote the program. The state also sends out applications to community-based organizations. I know a lot of domestic violence agencies receive like a box of applications. We usually receive a box too, both in English and Spanish. So if you need an application, now Kelly's going to send out the application in Spanish and English. So you'll have those that you can print out and help people fill out, or help them fill it out online. But those are some of the efforts that do go into it. But certainly it's, you know, it's, as Kadeem said, the onus is upon us as communities or services for the low-income community to do as much as we can to promote the program. I think last I looked, enrollment in LIHEAP is somewhere around 20% of the eligible population. Those aren't very recent numbers, so that may have grown, but we certainly need to do more to get the word out, because as you learned through this presentation, a lot of folks are going to qualify. Are there any other questions that folks have about LIHEAP? If not, this last slide has our contact information. You can reach any one of us, as I said in the beginning of the call, with any questions that you run into, both on LIHEAP and on any of the other assistance programs. Remember, LIHEAP is different and distinct from many of the utility programs. A lot of your clients are going to think that because they received LIHEAP, that they also, you know, are enrolled in the customer assistance program or something like that. But they are distinct programs. They can participate in all of them.
So there's a question on self-certification for deliverable fuel sources. I have never actually had to deal with that issue, but I think it's a self-certification, as in you sign the form saying I have less than 15 days fuel left. I don't know that LIHEAP is capable of coming out to your house and basically measuring the fuel in your tank. It's on a good faith effort basis to the client to certify. And if you do run into an issue where someone says like your clients applied, made this certification, and they're receiving pushback from either DHS or their county assistance office on, that's something to rope us in or rope in DHS directly so that they can be aware of that, because it's just a self-certification from everything that I've seen.
It's a checkbox on the application. And as I was talking about before with that SPIL program and applying for cash first and then crisis second, as a practical matter, I don't think that it becomes an issue, because if you want to maximize your grant eligibility, you're going to apply for cash first, and then you're going to go in and apply for crisis. So folks aren't, it's not in their best interest to pursue a crisis grant if they don't have 15 days or less, because the cash grant first is going to help them more. But good question. Any other questions folks have? Well, I think if there are no other questions and you have our contact information, I think we are ending pretty much exactly on time. So thanks for spending your Tuesday afternoon with us, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Liz and Kadeem.